I love theology. I love studying and writing and thinking about God. I'm here for all the books and lectures I can get my hands on. But I'm also under no illusion that when I'm gone, any of my words will be remembered. The only thing that will outlive me, and probably you, is the way that we've loved the people near us and inspired more grace around us. All right, today we are talking about how we relate in our summer spaces. And we're going to cover going home, grandmothers, Jesus' brother, and theology as biography. And this conversation about relating in summer space, of course, immediately makes us think about my home. The neighborhood kids all finding their way into our backyard, and slack lines and zip lines strung all over the place. There has been a lot of laughter and honestly a few tears in our backyard this summer. But this year, that word primarily for me evokes the memory of my childhood home. Because just a few weeks ago, I found myself visiting family in Ontario, hanging out in the same basement that I grew up in. We're at an interesting point in our family's life cycle. I have a sister who lives with her family in Ontario, and I have another sister who lives with her family in Australia, and Rachel and I, of course, here in Alberta with our kids. And yet somehow my parents are still in the same home that I lived in when I went to high school in Peterborough, Ontario, some 30 years ago. Now, my parents are at a point where perhaps in the next few years they may downsize and divest themselves of that space that holds a lot of memory for all of us as kids, but they're not there yet. And so this summer, we were actually able to coordinate all three of us as siblings to find our way back home at the same time. And that meant 6 grandkids flooding the house and scouring the fridge, falling asleep in every corner, and generally filling every square foot of my parents' home with, let's just say, a lot of noise. And it was, first of all, wonderful for me to see my sisters. It had been way too long. And it was beautiful to watch my kids interact with their cousins. That's difficult when we're so spread out. But in some ways, I think the highlight of my summer was watching my parents extend the same kind of grace and welcome and genuine love to my adopted kids that I absolutely remember from my childhood. See, the thing is, I know that not everyone here has the same experience of family. And sometimes for those of us for whom family has been gift, that can be easy to lose sight of. And sometimes it's being back in those spaces that jogs those memories of just how special it all was and honestly still is. Sitting in the basement outside the same bedroom in the house that I grew up in, just outside that bedroom where I spent a lot of time as a moody teenager. By the way, we were back. And we were also visiting my in-laws and my mother-in-law and covered some photos of me in high school looking very on brand as a 90s emo kid. That's not an image of me, but basically could have been. And I'm just praying that she did not show any of those photos to my kids or it will ruin their attitude for a generation. Regardless, sitting in that old basement outside my old bedroom, watching my kids do more damage to my parents' couch than it had suffered in decades, and seeing my parents just revel in it all, I think it was good for my kids. I know it was good for me to be reminded of this incredible head start that I was offered simply by being loved well, even when I looked like that. See, there's this passage in 2 Timothy where the writer is composing a letter to a young pastor, almost a protege, you might say. And I love it because the letter opens this way: "To Timothy, my dear son, I thank God whom I serve just as my ancestors did. I am now reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I'm now persuaded lives also in you." Keep in mind here, this is a conversation that's happening probably between the first and the second generation of Christian followers. And we're already seeing references to our ancestors, references to mothers and grandmothers called out by name to acknowledge what's handed down to us through family, and how important it is to be reminded of everything we've been given. I mean, imagine if you and I, if we knew a little bit more about Eunice and Lois, I'd love to read that. I'd love to learn from them. Because, and I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but there's this interesting debate about these two. There's this statement about them and their influence, and then some translations, like the NIV, which I'm reading from, they insert a new heading here. And they begin a new paragraph as if the writer's moving on to something else. But there's actually a really good argument to just keep the narrative flowing here like most translations do, like the NRSV does. I'm now reminded of your sincere faith, Timothy, faith which first lived in your grandmother and your mother, faith I'm now persuaded lives in you, and for this reason, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of hands, for the Spirit of God has not made us timid, but instead given us power and love and self-discipline. Famous verse, but the implication here is that everything gifted to Timothy actually roots itself all the way back in the legacy of Eunice and Lois. Power and love and self-discipline. Sometimes that's what we get from our moms. Now, at the same time, I get it, right? No one here in the room has the same story of family as anyone else. And I'm not interested in re-narrating your history for you. All I'm saying is that my summer spaces have reminded me of the gift of my family and the responsibility that I now have to work to carry that forward for my kids today. In fact, seeing our kids adopted so freely into the story that raised me, even as Rachel and I have been welcomed into the stories of their birth families so graciously, it reminds me of the opportunity that family offers us to extend probably much farther than we sometimes imagine. And for that, I want to talk about James. See, there's this book in our Bible called James that is, at least according to church history, written by the brother of Jesus. And familial connections aside, I'm not sure being Jesus' bro automatically makes you second in command. I'm not sure it works that way, but it certainly does make for some interesting dynamics, I imagine. Particularly when one of the only direct references to the brothers of Jesus comes to us from the Gospel of John. There we read that Jesus' brothers said to him, "Leave Galilee and go to Judea so that your disciples there may see the works that you do. No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. Since you're doing all these great things, go show yourself to the world." And I'm not sure if you're picking up on the sarcasm here, but if not, just to make it clear, John adds this: even his brothers didn't really believe in him. Essentially, these are his brothers coming along and being like, "That's some big claims, big bro. Let's see you back them up." And honestly, having a few siblings of my own, that seems legit. But the question then is, how do we get from there to James' words in our Bible some 2,000 years later? And how does that relate to some of the summer spaces we occupy? And that's an interesting journey, at least it is to me. And we should start probably with this question: what do we actually know about Jesus' childhood? The answer is, unfortunately, not much. We do have some fan fiction, though. There is the infancy Gospel of Thomas, written somewhere in the mid to late 2nd century, still pretty early, that's somewhere in the late 100s. But it's fun to know that the early Christians were wondering about these same questions. What was Jesus' childhood like? And they had a little fun speculating about it. Some good stories there. There's a story about how Jesus, as a young child, makes some clay pigeons and then makes them come to life and fly away. That's a nice story. There's a story about Jesus getting mad at a couple neighborhood kids and cursing them to death and then making their parents blind. That's not as great a story. Thankfully, he does get in trouble for that one, and he undoes all the damage, including resurrecting his childhood nemesis. So thank you, Mary and Joseph, for being good parents. In general, though, the infancy gospel has a lot of childhood hijinks, including at one point healing his brother James from a snake bite. Now that's nice, but at the same time, maybe we shouldn't take these infancy stories all too seriously as a source for James' bona fides. There is, however, some detail that we can piece together from the actual Gospels. And actually, both Mark and Matthew record a story when people are asking about Jesus, and they say this. They say, look, isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son, the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us now? From that, we can surmise that Jesus was one of at least 7 kids. He's got 4 named brothers and at least 2 sisters, and one of those brothers was named James. We also have a reference from Paul, who writes about his time in Jerusalem and says that he saw none of the other apostles, only James, the brother of Jesus. So we know Jesus had siblings. We know one of them was named James. We know at one point they didn't really buy into what Jesus was saying about himself. And we know that by the time Paul comes around and encounters Jesus, at least one of those brothers James has become an important figure within the early Jesus community. What we can't say for certain is whether that James wrote the letter that's in our Bibles. It does seem plausible, considering how early the letter was adopted and considered authoritative. I mean, you have Irenaeus quoting the book of James already in the 2nd century. And we actually did a series on the letter of James. It's in our archives if you're interested in digging through some of the major ideas in the letter. Still, let's take a quick look here at questions of authorship before we get to perhaps the more interesting part for today. And the most common objection to the brother of Jesus actually being the author of James is the competency of the Greek in this letter. Now, if you read it in Greek, it's not particularly poetic, but it is generally grammatically correct. And it's obviously written by someone pretty comfortable with Greek as a language. And so the objection here is, look, this could not possibly have been written by the brother of a carpenter from Nazareth. I'll grant, fair question. The image of rural Jewish people, however, in ancient Palestine is uneducated hicks. That's probably an unwarranted stereotype that has more to do with modern sensibilities than it does ancient ones, though. Certainly, there was stigma attached to this region. If you remember, there's a line in John 1, can anything good come from Nazareth? Clearly a little snobbishness in that world, same as ours. However, if you've also ever talked to a tradesperson about math, or seen a framer work with fractions, you know that the skills that we use daily get the most developed. And in the ancient world, multiple languages were just part of life. There's an old saying, you learn Hebrew for worship, Aramaic for friendship, Greek for commerce, and Latin for politics. That's how the ancient world worked. And so if James comes from a family of carpenters that are doing business with a lot of clients across the region, the idea of developing a functional but pretty straightforward grasp of Greek is particularly unpredictable. In fact, it's probably just part of doing business. A second major objection is actually the first line of the letter, though. This is what James writes. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, people have argued, look, if this is really the brother of Jesus, then almost certainly they're going to mention that, right? Wouldn't they? I mean, who doesn't use the chance to name drop their brother, the Messiah, in a letter that they're writing? Look, if I ever meet Eddie Vedder, you will never stop hearing about it. It will be referenced in every sermon for the rest of my career. Pearl Jam, look it up. Still, what's interesting here is that in one of the other very few references to Jesus' childhood and family, we get a glimpse into Jesus' enigmatic thoughts about trading on the family name. In Mark 3, crowds are getting bigger, and they're becoming a little uncomfortable for Jesus' family. He's getting a little too famous for their liking. And so at one point, while he's teaching, they decide, look, we're going to pull him aside and ask him to ease up on the riz. And they can't get his attention, so one of the disciples flags him down and says, look, your brothers are here. They want to talk to you. And Jesus says, in front of the whole crowd, I might add, who are my mother and my brothers? Then he looks at those with him and he says, here are my mother, here are my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my family. Now, kind of an interesting moment. Certainly could have been taken as a slight by his brothers, probably was, might betray some of the tension that we find later when we hear that the brothers do not buy into what Jesus is selling. At the same time, I can imagine that if over time, perhaps even after Jesus dies, James actually comes to see his brother as the Messiah, perhaps part of that awakening is also this embrace of an extended imagination of family Jesus invites us all to consider. And look, I'm not saying that family of origin was unimportant to Jesus. It clearly was. He goes out of his way to ensure his mother is going to be looked after before his death. He wants to know she'll be cared for. He absolutely does care about family. It's just that I think for Jesus, in the kingdom, there's more to family than just blood. And let's be honest, for those of us with, let's say, adopted kids, or for those of us for whom chosen family really is family, I think that's important to hear. But personally, I also think it's interesting to consider that when James comes around to the idea of Jesus, part of that is embracing this more expansive, more generous, more expanded view of what family is. And so when he writes, he says, look, you know who I am. But I'm not here to trade on my brother's name. I'm here to serve his way in the world. And James' voice, for whatever influence it will gain in the early Christian community, he wants it to be a reflection of how he continues the way that his brother taught, not his proximity to power. I like that. Still, there's one more objection to James as the brother of Jesus, and it's the lack of theology. At least theology as defined by some Christians, like Martin Luther, who famously was not a fan of this letter. And it's true. James doesn't contain a lot of theology, at least not the kind that Paul likes to do. Instead, the letter of James focuses on things like how we should talk to each other and how we should care for the least among us and how we should avoid showing favoritism. At one point, James even goes as far as to say that pure religion, real religion, as far as he's concerned, doesn't have to do with God talk at all. It's how we look after orphans and widows in their distress. That's what's important. And I have some thoughts about this. First, the idea that the kind of theological speculation that Paul engages in, the kind of stuff that I, let's be honest, really do like to read and study and write. But this idea that wondering about God is more important than wondering about what your neighbor needs, not only is that a false dichotomy, it honestly feels pretty un-Jesus-y, doesn't it? I love theology. I love studying and writing and thinking about God. I'm here for all the books and lectures I can get my hands on. But I'm also under no illusion that when I'm gone, any of my words will be remembered. The only thing that will outlive me, and probably you, is the way that we've loved the people near us and inspired more grace around us. And I'm good with that. And for me, the fact that James eventually comes around to Jesus, but does that primarily through his concern for his neighbors, well, this is perhaps why our space matters so much. Why proximity really is important in relationships. See, Paul did a lot of good thinking about Jesus, really good thinking about Jesus. A lot of work making sense of the Jesus story for all of us. And I am, like all of Christianity since, deeply indebted to all of Paul's thinking. But James actually grew up in the space with Jesus, relating to Jesus, wrestling with what he saw in Jesus, perhaps sometimes even rejecting what he heard from Jesus. But ultimately, James was too close to Jesus to forget it. And I think that matters sometimes. See, I think where you come from, where I come from, all of the stories that have led us here to this moment, all of the ways that we relate to our history, I think all of that over time actually does become us. And that doesn't mean that you can't overcome those relations. Doesn't mean you can't rise above them. It just means that they are part of you. Just like my mom and my dad and my bedroom in the basement of the house that I grew up in are all still very much part of me, even when I forget it. The truth is, we don't know a lot about Jesus' childhood. But even the gaps that we don't know tell us something, I think. We know his father was there at his birth. We know his father was there when he was a young boy. But then after that, we also know it's always just Jesus and his mother and his brothers, his sisters that surround him. No dad. And sure, we are speculating now, but if James is the younger brother growing up, watching his family struggle in a single-parent home, and watching his mother grieve her loss, and watching his brother give himself away to care for others, struggling to make sense of all that, but then eventually coming around to the idea that this love he sees in Jesus is really the way to live. And perhaps, as they say, all theology is biography. And it's not just our best thinking that matters. It's our being in the space together. And proximity with the people that you want to be like that ultimately shapes us. See, I think James' theology was born from the same kind of summer spaces and childhood bedrooms and complicated memories that you and I share with our families as well. And I'm so glad that eventually he found a way to turn all of that back toward Jesus. And my hope is that as I reflect on summer spaces, as you do the same, we might actually find Jesus there with us as well. Hey, Jeremy here, and thank you for clicking through to watch that video. If you're intrigued by the work that we're doing here at Commons, you can, of course, hit subscribe to keep up to date with all of the content that we're posting here on YouTube. You can head to our website at commons.church, and you can find us on all of the socials at Commons Church. You can also join our Discord. There, the community is having all kinds of conversations about how we can encourage each other in the way of Jesus. Head to commons.church/Discord for the invite there. Also, leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you and all the ways that you are journeying on this path toward Jesus. But thanks for tuning in. Thanks for all the ways that you contribute to this conversation. Together, we'll see you soon.